Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally grateful to be here, and I'm truly grateful that you have tuned in to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is episode 201, and today in Counselling Foundations, we're going to start off by looking at developing a non-judgmental attitude. We then drift our way into focus on self, where we're going to be looking at how we set our boundaries as a therapist. And then finally, we're going to end episode 201 with Practice Matters, where we have Daniel Winstanley spoke with Rory about talking respectfully about sexuality and gender identity. So that's our episode today, and we start off visiting those counselling foundations, where we recognize that the foundations, the very basics of counselling, that's what we build our practice on. And one of those foundations, no matter what modality you're practicing, is some form of non-judgmental way of being, a non-judgmental attitude. But it's tricky, Rory.
It is. I'd like to start off this section with a short story from my teaching days. I remember teaching a level 2 class many years ago. Lovely group. And if you are one of that group, you know, lovely group, level 2 group. And I remember talking about unconditional positive regard, which of course was one of Roger's necessary and sufficient conditions that he outlined in the 1957 Journal of Consulting Psychology, that groundbreaking journal he published about clinicians being more human, more connected, that set the tone for up till the work we do today. And I said, sometimes it could be quite difficult for people to develop a non-judgmental attitude. And somebody in the group said, I'm non-judgmental and wax lyrical. And to be fair, the person was a lovely, lovely, lovely person who'd had a very difficult life and was helping others in their life difficulties. And it was 2008, just at the time of the banking crisis. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to set you a little task here. You know, you're working maybe with a therapist, with someone who's a merchant banker who is now earning considerably less than they were 2 years ago, and they cannot afford their new Porsche sports car, and they've come to you because they're feeling they can't keep up with their friends. And there was uproar. Bankers ruining the economy, and they destroyed the economy, and this and that. And I just sat and watched, and eventually these bemused faces realized what I'd done. Of course, I'd given them a scenario where I knew that they may find the particular pastiche of a person I presented was unacceptable, and it gave them food for thought. Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes, we have stereotypes of people, and we judge on those stereotypes. Indeed,
and I think if we're looking at the topic of unconditional positive regard, being non-judgmental within a relationship, I think it starts with us looking at self, because the judgment starts from within and is projected outward. It's interesting, Rory, when you were speaking through that scenario, the word you used were them bankers, and that is a great indicator that there is a prejudging, a prejudice that is held toward, as soon as any person or group of people has a label that puts them within another group, them bankers. It's like this group of bankers that maybe the frustration is focused on. But it's about coming back to our own self concept. Who are we? And I graduated as a therapist many moons ago, Rory, and I've been in practice for many moons and in training for many moons. I've taught, been a supervisor, and I can happily say today that I hold judgments. I do, because of who I am, how I grew up, the road I traveled, and I think that I would be lying to myself if I said, I've gone past all of that. I've transcended judgment. Just try cutting me off as I'm turning, or try taking my space in a car park before me, and then you're going to see that judgmental side of me come out. So it's not that we need to be superhuman as practitioners. It's about us understanding what our own self-concept is. What is the journey that we have traveled, recognizing where we may hold prejudice or where we may be judgmental on certain aspects, and putting that one side, putting that outside of the professionally held relationship that we share with a client. Because when we're looking at that client, in front of us is a fellow human being, and that is something that links us together. No matter who they are, no matter what job they've done, no matter what their life experience, they are a fellow human being. Even if they can't speak the same language as us, they are a fellow human being, and in that we are connected. And in that we can empathically recognize that each one of us walks a road, and we become a product of the road we have walked, and that may cause us to act in certain ways, to hold certain views, certain strong views, I might add. But it is a product of the road we've walked, not a badness within the person. So when we're talking about unconditional positive regard, it doesn't mean we accept everything they may say or every value they may hold. No. What we do accept is their right to hold that, and the fact that they are a human and they are thinking that way, feeling that way because of a road they've walked, not because of a fault within them.
I like that. I like the idea that all our behaviour is directed at our experience. And it was something that Rogers talked about, and many psychologists have alluded to. All behaviour is goal-directed. You can meet people who've done things and you think, that's awful. And then when you hear their side of the story, the deed may not be any less awful, but the road to it may give us a real indication of where that person was. I worked for a long time for a charity that rehoused offenders, people coming out of prison. Some had done some terrible, terrible things. And one of the things that I found very quickly is those people who had done terrible, terrible things were not devils with tails. They were humans just like us. It was just that part of their behaviour, and in some cases, part of their personality drove them to doing terrible things, but they weren't universally terrible, if that makes any sense. It was only part of their behaviour. And I learned a lot. I was there for 5 years. And I met people who, I don't want to kind of labour the point here, who'd done really terrible things. And it was really interesting after I'd worked with a few of these folk. I realised that it was just one part of them. There was a part of them. There were very few, if any, really, that were universally evil. I think that's the first thing, this idea of good and evil to exercise from us as therapists. They are absolutes that we use when we cannot find an explanation for behavior. So we just label it as it's evil. It's evil, as opposed to kind of looking at the more nuanced view of things.
It's tricky when we're speaking about unconditional positive regard, a non-judgmental view of a fellow human, because we live in a conditional world. The world is conditional. You have a status in society dependent on who you are, what your birthright is, where you're born in the world, what language you speak, what religion you follow, what car you drive, what label of clothing you wear, how much you earn, what house you live in. It's a condition. You are maybe viewed as being worth more if you have a high-paying job living in a high-income area driving a big shiny car. And it's really interesting that I think to understand unconditional positive regard, we first need to look to conditions of worth, where we're saying somebody is worth more because they match certain conditions. Again, we're looking at the person-centered theory here. Conditions of worth, an example of that, a child in school does well in a test or examination and they are praised for that. It's conditional. It's not non-conditional acceptance. Oh, you've done well. Well done. Oh, who's clever then? This is great. 3 cheers for this person who's done well. This person over here did not do quite as well in this test. You really need to pull your socks up. You need to try a little bit harder. It is a conditional world. We've grown up in this conditional world, recognizing conditions of worth, recognizing the conditions that are attached to being non-judgmental, I think is a great start in understanding unconditional positive regard, or coming from a non-judgmental place. And again, I think it all starts with self. There's not a book we can read where we can walk away and go, now I get it. Yep, that's it. It's about stripping away our own conditions of worth and recognizing them, seeing who we are, recognizing our own prejudices from the road that we have walked. And there's some great questions that are in the handout that Rory has provided for us today. Now, if you want to get this handout, it's on unconditional positive regard, non-judgmental being within a counselling relationship. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcasts tab, find episode 201, and it's right there on the page. You can download that. And this exercise is an exercise in exploring some of your own attitudes, your own values, and your own qualities. And I'm going to now give you just 10 quick questions. And of course, these questions are on that handout, so go and get it. One thing I like about myself is... Now, that's an interesting one, Rory, because I think if you put that out as an exercise to a group of people and said 2 columns, one column, the things you don't like about yourself, the other column, the things you like about yourself. I wonder which column people would start with first. I wonder which column would outweigh the other.
I think it's a bit of form. I think it's a bit of former rather than the latter.
Yeah.
And I think if you put another column in next to that, where it said the things I don't like about myself, if you put a column in saying, are the things you don't like about yourself things that you've been told about yourself from others, that column would fill up pretty quickly as well, because we do get our views of ourselves from others, especially as children.
Definitely. So that's the one. The next one is one thing others like about me is, and that's an interesting one, because that is going into the frame of reference of another, what people might have told you. And then how is that accepted? If somebody says, oh, you're really good at such a thing, do you deflect that and go, oh, no, not really, ha, 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 and dodge that? Or do you accept that and go, wow, thank you, I accept that, I embrace that? Number 3, what I dislike in others is, this is a daring to be congruent and honest and put it down. You know, you started this topic, Rory, speaking about maybe those in the beginning of their journey into counselling, when faced with unconditional positive regard, going, I accept other people, I'm fully accepting. I think it takes some personal development to sit down and write, what I dislike in others is being truthful and accepting that part of self that is maybe unacceptable even to self. Number 4 is what others dislike about me. Maybe an easier question to answer. What does that bring up for you? Number 5, I am really pleased with myself when... What pleases you? What is it that when you have completed a certain thing or something happens that you go, yes, it lights you up and it brings that warmth? One thing I'd like to change is, and that's an interesting one, that's number 6, one thing I'd like to change. What would be that one thing? And that's looking at self. That's really accepting self. Number 7, one thing I cannot cope with very well is, that's a good one. One thing I do very well is, one way I show I care for others is, that is number 9. And number 10, I really give myself a hard time when. When do you, listening to this, give yourself a hard time? I know I do. I'll be driving along giving myself a hard time. I give myself hard times about things that happened decades ago. Something I might have said to someone years ago. I'll give myself a hard time today. And I don't remember the book, Rory, but I remember reading this in a book where it suggested that humans are the only animal, if we look at ourselves as biologically as an animal, the only animal that punishes itself again and again and again and again for the same act. Any other animal, the act, the punishment is there, and that's it. It's gone. It's move on. I give myself a hard time when.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is part of forming a non-judgmental attitude. You know, if you can forgive yourself, if you can find self-forgiveness, then it's got to be easier to be able to accept others. But, you know, when you can say, well, look, you know, I've done that. I made him. We all make mistakes. I make hundreds of them. And when you can forgive yourself and say, well, you know, I'm only human, then I think it becomes easier then to transpose that attitude onto somebody else. But you're absolutely right, Ken. This idea that we are universally non-judgmental, I think, is a misnomer. We do make judgments. You want to sit in my car when I drive to a tea room, you know, I can make hundreds of them on other people's driving because, of course, I'm an expert in driving, not
self-elected.
Yes, self-elected expert, and we have to be forgiving of ourselves. But you bring up some interesting things. Certainly, when you talk about self-praise and, you know, self-congratulation, it tends to be something that people feel very difficult about. Praising themselves. And of course, praising and certainly prizing is the basis of unconditional positive regard. Prizing that person in front of you as another human being. And as you know, as Martin Buber famously said, the philosopher, it's about the I and thou relationship. Not I and it, I and thou, me and you. And here is you, and there you are. And I think it can be an interesting journey as we begin to accept ourselves. We become, I think by default, we become more accepting of others.
It's paradoxical in that being unconditionally regarding someone else and non-judgmental of someone else, we can't even begin to consider that before we look to ourselves. Can we reflect that same non-judgmental attitude towards ourselves? Can we look back at our past mistakes, our transgressions, our regrets, and go, you know, I'm only human. I did that because of the road I walked, because of the situation I was in at that time, and look at it with unconditional positive regard and self-love, because that is the basis, that is the seed for giving that to others. I think this is an incredible topic. Really get that handout. It is truly worth it. CounsellingTutor.com podcast tab, episode 201. Go and download that handout. This has been a visit to the Counselling Foundations. And as we kind of reverse out of the unconditional positive regard, being non-judgmental, we're going to focus on self, which it just ties together so beautifully because we've recognized that unconditional positive regard does start with self. And self is the key in any therapeutic relationship. Without you being there, there is no therapy. And we need to look to ourselves first. And today we talk about setting your own boundaries. And I know what it looks like when boundaries slip, Rory. For myself, I've find myself right now in a position where my self-care boundaries have slipped, and I've prioritized work because it's really important and this needs to get done, and there's times, it's time bound, and all of this kind of the reasons used to justify it. But within that, my own boundaries have slipped and my own self-care has slipped, and I'm less effective at doing what I need to do as a result. And these boundaries, so important.
I absolutely can. And it's something maybe that people don't consider too much before they go into counselling training. Certainly I didn't hear the term boundaries very much before I entered the classroom. And it was only when it was outlined, you know, what are your boundaries? What do you do that puts yourself in harm's way? And I think that was an exercise we were asked to do. People were writing lists up. I know I had quite a long list. And the idea that we offer ourselves love, offer ourselves compassion, and say, I'm not going to do that. That's not good for me. And sometimes that can be pretty tough. I can say that through the arc of my training, I lost a lot of people I thought were friends because they had attitudes. And I'll be honest, maybe I went along with those attitudes to be part of the gang. People would say sexist and racist things, and maybe at the time, to be fit in, I might laugh along and oh yes, that was really funny. And it was only as I started to go through training, I thought, well, these are really unacceptable. They were always unacceptable, but perhaps it was having the courage to be able to say, I just can't laugh at that, and I just don't think it's funny. And I can remember people kind of saying, well, really, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And at the time, I felt that was quite tough. However, in retrospect, I realized that I made the decision. I had to be true to myself. And I think it was Bern Brown who said that people who have boundaries are the most compassionate people, tend to be the most compassionate people because they are the most contained. They know the limits of themselves. And it's just so important. And I think it's an ongoing piece of work, Ken, as you seem to be discovering or have discovered.
Yeah. Oh, very, very much so. And I love that you've linked two words together, boundaries and courage. And boundaries take courage. It takes courage it doesn't maybe take the courage to set the boundary. It's when that boundary is approached, it takes courage to hold the boundary. It's very easy to go, I will not laugh at inappropriate jokes if I'm in company and I feel pressure from others. But then put yourself in that company with others, in that situation, then the courage comes in. So boundaries go hand in hand with courage. And it's interesting, when we think about boundaries, we may think about professional boundaries within a counselling relationship, that it is a time-bound session, that the client would not be expected to contact us outside of that boundary, that there are boundaries of confidentialities. And yes, of course, we study those boundaries when we're studying to become a practitioner. But what about our personal boundaries? Do we set the same boundaries for self as we set within our professional practice? What do those boundaries look like? What are your boundaries for you and your life? And I think that there's areas that certainly, I'm using self-care, and self-care is such an important part of just being human, really. We live in a confusing world at best, a very fast-moving, confusing world. We weren't designed for this. Biologically, we were designed to hunt, gather, live in caves, drink from streams, and we drive around in shiny metal boxes at 70 miles an hour down concrete plains. It's just insane. We weren't built for this biologically. And it wears us out. It breaks us down. We know from offering telephone and online counselling via video and Zoom that it's very different. The boundaries are different in terms of how quickly you will wear out. You get screen fatigue. So we do wear out. And personal boundaries, so important, because we stop working at our optimal, really. And it goes into a place where we're just going through the motions because we haven't looked to ourselves.
Absolutely. And here's a challenge if you're listening. If you're in practice, maybe you're a student, maybe you're a qualified colleague, have you discussed boundaries in supervision recently? Have you sat and said to your supervisor, I want to kind of talk about my boundaries? And my guess would be perhaps you have, but I would guess that a majority of people learn about them at college, kind of have a nod to them occasionally. But how was the last time you actually sat down and said, what are my boundaries around, A, B, C, D, my family, my work, my client work? And have you written them down? Have you written your boundaries down? Is there any way you can reference them? Because I think that there's a lot of talk about boundaries, but I just wonder how we know we're putting effective boundaries in.
And it's you may be thinking, well, where do I put boundaries? How do I know where to put boundaries? And so personal care is one area that I recognize because it's coming up for me right now. But what you can do is kind of observe your life and look for areas where you start feeling pain, and have a look at what's causing the pain and ask yourself, is there a boundary that I can put in place that would avoid me getting to that point of pain. And that's a great exploration of self. If you're journaling on a daily basis, this is a great exercise to do. What pain did I face today? What resistance did I face today? What negative emotions came up in me? Is it a result of me could I put a boundary in that if I didn't overstep it, that would prevent that? And boundary for me is a fixed structure, a boundary. It's not something that moves. It's not elastic. It doesn't stretch and move. It stays in place. So if you think of a boundary in a field, now you can have fields just stretching on for miles, and you can walk up and down those fields without really knowing where you are, where you're going. As soon as you put a boundary in, I don't go past here. And one of my personal boundaries used to be that if I went out for an evening with friends, I would not have more than 3 beers. It was just 3 beers. That was my boundary. And I found that I was unable to stick to the boundary. It was fine. On my way there in the car, I'm only going to have 3 beers. Obviously, I wasn't driving back. I'm only going to have 3 beers. But as soon as I was at the party or the get-together, after the second beer and the third one coming along, I wasn't going, okay, this is my last. Or maybe even I was saying, okay, this is my last. But then half an hour after that third one, I go, you know what? So what I did was I revisited that. I recognized that that was not a boundary because it was moving. It was elastic. It kept on. It would go from 3 to 4 to whatever number. So I changed the boundary to 0 beers. And it's been like that now for well over a decade for me. And that is a lot easier for me to keep, just know. Because I know as soon as I have a couple of beers, I want another one. They're very Moorish for me. I've got the warm glow and I'm enjoying the people. And my boundaries slip. They go. So 0 beers. I can still have a great time, but I can hold that boundary for myself.
Yeah, absolutely can. And I can certainly empathize with your 0 beers policy because I did the same about a decade ago. And I think that what happens is that when you apply a boundary and say that is it, you automatically reap the benefit of it. So in terms of the 0 beers, I'm fully in control of what I say. It does mean I can drive there and back. It also means that I've got a little bit more money in my pocket, and I don't wake up with a blinding headache and minor brain loss and damage. Yes. So the knock on of having a boundary, and I like what you say, Ken, about boundaries being a fence for a very good reason. And where I live in a kind of semi-rural area, and we have fences for good reasons. You cross a fence, you could end up falling over into a quarry or something like that. And I think that having personal boundaries and saying, no, I find myself saying, I don't do this, or it's because I don't do it. Don't explain yourself. If you're thinking of putting a boundary in and you're thinking, well, what will other people say? Don't explain yourself. You just say, I don't do it.
Those boundaries are there in service of you. In service of you, to keep your well-being, to hold your well-being, to stop you going too far, to stop other people bothering you at times that you shouldn't be bothered. And again, full circle back to it takes courage. It, in the same way as it takes courage within the therapy room, if a client arrives 15 minutes late for their session, we've already boundaried that the session starts here and it ends there. We don't just ignore it and hope that will go away. No. We have to exercise courage and recognize and say, when we first met up, we set a time of starting at this time and starting at this time. And I see that is now broken. How can we revisit that? Because it's broken. It hasn't stretched. Yes. It hasn't just overstretched. It's broken. How can we revisit that? How might we put that back in place so that we don't face that together again? And of course, if it may be traffic or something, you might put a boundary in that, if you are going to be late, you send me a text or whatever it is, you work around it. But it's that courage to face those boundaries. And I wonder, listening to this, what are the boundaries within your life, not within your practice, but within your life, that keep you well, that keep you charged? Maybe something for the journals there. Definitely a great topic.
Absolutely. And, maybe, as you say, it doesn't have to be professional obligation in terms of boundaries. We have boundaries in our professional work. But have you got a friend maybe who's phoning you up for free therapy, or will phone you up at inappropriate times and start with the opening gamut of, well, you're a counsellor, aren't you? And I've got this, I've had that, and I say, I'm not at work today, and you're not my client. It's lovely to speak with you, but I'm not your client. It doesn't mean you can't be a good friend, but it does mean that you're alert to someone using you for other than friendship. And I know that happens, and I know it happens because sometimes in our Facebook group, that comment comes up. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, if you type in Counselling Tutor into Facebook, you'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door and you'll join thousands of like-minded people, all enjoying the world of counselling and psychotherapy, students, qualified colleagues, supervisors, tutors, all discussing, issues around counselling, and boundaries does come up quite a lot, I have to say.
It does. And just with you like ending with that, Rory, I was just thinking of that courage to say that and maybe to a friend, hey, you're overstepping a boundary here, not this, whatever that this may be. And how you started this by saying along the road of exercising your boundaries, you lost some friends. But when you look back, for good reason, because if people are deliberately overstepping your boundaries when you've made it very clear what they are they really in service of you, your well-being, and I guess, do you want to keep them around if they insist on breaking the boundaries? Tricky.
I did lose a lot. I did lose a few friends, but I made a whole lot of new ones.
Yes,
who are also boundaried, who I have much more meaningful and deeper relationships with. When I meet with them, it's just on a completely different level. And it's about meaning and who we are and who they are, and an exploration of our friendship. And that is something I would never have experienced had I have not been introduced to the term boundaries on the second time I went into college, I think.
Yeah.
And had I not practiced them, and as Maya Angelou said, and I say this in the podcast a lot, without courage, you cannot practice any other virtue with consistency. It starts with that. It starts with self, and it starts with saying, I'm afraid, I don't find that funny. I'm afraid, I'm not even saying I'm afraid. I don't find that funny and I don't want to hear that. Or as you said, Ken, I think I'll just have a lemonade, not a beer tonight.
Wow, there you have it. So now on to Practice Matters. Practice Matters is our section where we look at something that may well come up in your practice. We don't know who the next client is that is about to walk through that door and what they may bring with them, or a long-term client that may say for the first time, you know what, I've never told anybody this, but, and that's what this Practice Matters is all about. And Rory, you met with Daniel Winstanley, and the topic was talking respectfully about sexuality and gender identity.
Absolutely. Such an important awareness to have in the world that we're living in. We're expanding, the world's expanding in terms of progression, people being and living to be who they really are and who they want to be. And in this interview, Daniel outlines some salient points in the lecture and gave us a lot of food for thought. And this is what he had to say.
Practice matters.
And we welcome Daniel Winstanley, who's done a fantastic lecture for the Counsellor CPD Library, talking respectfully about sexuality and gender identity with clients. So, Daniel, you're so welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Rory.
So, I guess the first question I want to ask, and it may seem a bit of a crass and obvious question, but why is it important that we consider talking respectfully about sexuality and gender identity with clients?
So, Rory, in the lecture, I talk a little bit about this, and it's maybe not an obvious question. I think, first of all, I want to acknowledge that many of our counselling courses have let us down in terms of helping us to talk about sexuality and gender identity, and the research suggests that even though I think there is an eagerness to talk about it, many trainees in particular come out feeling unprepared and have to sort of augment it with CPD or kind of learn as they go. In the lecture, I talk a little bit about the experience of sort of gender and sex diverse people. So, I also talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, plus people. And I talk about the ways in which language about these populations is used to medicalize, to criminalize in some situation historically and in other parts of the world. And so, many people will come into the counselling room potentially anticipating that being able to talk safely about sexuality and gender identity is off limits. And so it's really important that counsellors feel able to broach that safely, because it may be something that our clients find it hard to raise in the counselling room.
Yes, I think that's an interesting response. And I picked up right at the beginning of your answer that you said that our counselling courses let us down. Where are the gaps, do you think, Daniel, within first counsellor training when it comes to talking respectfully about sexuality and gender identity?
Oh, yeah. Where are the gaps? I think our counselling courses tend to sort of, despite I say giving lip service to diversity and difference, I think many people, myself included, feel that there's an assumption still that, in a sense, when we talk about the client, we're talking about a heterosexual cisgender client. And I don't think there's a lot of discussion about the diversity of human experience around sexuality and gender identity and relationship diversity and all these things that actually would probably help us with all of our clients, not just those who identify, for example, as LGBTQ plus. So I think we don't necessarily learn how to talk about it. We don't learn about cultural understandings of sexual and gender diversity. I mean, the list goes on, but we really don't even get the basics. And so if we then encounter a client who needs to talk about these issues and potentially what it's been like growing up in a society that isn't necessarily 100% accepting, we might be surprised. We might not be prepared to have that discussion, and I don't think that's good. That courses are sending out trainees and qualified counsellors into the world without that sort of understanding and reflection. And I think a lot of it is also about looking at what we ourselves have grown up with. In terms of toxic messages about diversity of gender and sexual orientation. And we all have work to do around that. We've all internalized messages, Rory. So I think it's really important that we have an opportunity to reflect on that. So we're not then bringing those assumptions into the counselling room with us.
I think it's a very comprehensive answer, Daniel, and I think my takeaway from that is it's a structural thing within training. The structure of the training needs to be built around diversity, not just as maybe specific modules in a course. It needs to run all the way through. And I'm sure there's a lot of tutors listening to this saying, "I do that. I know I did when I taught," but. Yeah. I think it is interesting to think about when people are planning lessons. Does it have enough of a diverse aspect? Which kind of leads me on to my next question, which is, I know a lot of people feel uncomfortable about offending people because They feel they may ask a clumsy question or make a clumsy assumption and cause offence. And I wonder what your observations are on that.
I mean, first of all, I think it's natural, given that, if our counselling training, and let's talk about education in general, if in our education we haven't had an opportunity to talk in safe spaces about these issues, then we're going to feel very clumsy, and we might worry. We might be aware that homophobia and transphobia exist, and biphobia and queerphobia exist in the world, and we might be worried about perpetuating those messages. So it is an understandable thing to worry about causing offence. But what I would invite people who are worried about causing offence to reflect on is there anything underneath that? Because ultimately, we don't want to be doing the mental and emotional work of unpacking the crappy messages that we got. Can I say crappy, Rory?
Yes, you can say crappy. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you're far away with that.
We all got bad messages about about gay people and lesbians and trans people growing up, and we don't want to be doing that unpacking in the room with the client. So the worry about offence might be, what have we not had an opportunity to investigate? So I think that is important, and I encourage people to find safe spaces to have those discussions, so they're not so worried about offending. But I suppose the other thing that I would say is that, I know we worry about hurting our clients, but in some senses we probably do hurt our clients, and it's about being attuned to, oh yeah, I didn't quite say that right. What it's like for me to say that. I'm not saying it's okay to, just use whatever words we want. And I think there's also an awareness that there's some wrong or outdated terminology that's out there, and so it is possible to offend. And I think people get very overwhelmed at the range of terminology that's out there. That for example, particularly online communities, it's very sophisticated, people's understanding of their sexuality and gender identity. And if you're new to this, that can be a little bit overwhelming. But it is important not to avoid it, because when we avoid it, we're also sending a message to our clients, and that is that it's not safe. That it's not okay to talk about gender identity and sexuality in this space, and that's also a message that we don't want to send.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like education is the key, and unpacking your own history and the interjects, the messages, the injunctions that you've had through your life, maybe quite toxic. So I guess this is why this lecture is very, very important. It's going to help with that reflection. Finally, Daniel, what do you hope that people will take away from this lecture that you've given?
I hope people will feel a little less scared about talking about gender identity and sexual orientation. It is not intended to be a comprehensive course or a comprehensive discussion. I would like it to be a springboard for people to step off and go, okay, I don't understand much about that identity or that practice, and I'd like to go and find out more about it. Whether that's going to like academic articles, or whether that's going to onto YouTube, like to find people's lived experiences. And I think that this can really help us to sensitize us, and also hearing people's own words, how important it is to identify be able to speak freely about their experience. So I think that would be a starting point. And also, I think finally to tune into the language that your client is using as well is really important. If there's a fear of offending, just as we do all the time, listen to the client and correct and be humble and say, look, what's the way that I should refer to this? Like, how would you like me to refer to this? Because looking at lists of categories is helpful. That's the background research, but we also have to deal with the client in the room who might have a particular way in which they'd like us to speak to them.
Well, I think on that compassionate call to action, I will thank you for both the podcast and the lecture. So Daniel Winstanley, thank you so much for joining us.
A big thank you to Daniel Winstanley for that interview with you, Rory. Thank you to you, Rory, for hosting that interview. And of course, if you enjoyed this topic and you want to delve a little deeper, you can do so in the Counsellor CPD library. If you're not a member of the Counsellor CPD library, just go to counsellingtutor.com. The information is there. If you are a member, log in, and Daniel's lecture on talking respectfully about sexuality and gender identity has been uploaded for you. This has been episode 201 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
And what interesting topics, if I say so myself. We started with Counselling Foundations, developing a non-judgemental attitude. In Focus on Self, we talked about setting your boundaries, and in Practice Matters, interview with Daniel Winstanley, talking respectfully about sexuality and gender with clients. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.